Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the Conversations in Moral Theology. This is a show sponsored by New Wine, New Wineskins, an association for early career Catholic moral theologians, and by the Catholic Moral Theology blog. I'm Alessandro Rovati, and today I am joined by Lisa Cahill, who is a J. Donald Monon professor at Boston College. I have invited her to talk about her book, Blessed Are the Peacemakers, Pacifism, Just War, and Peacebuilding, which was published in 2019 by Fortress Press. Lisa, welcome to the Conversations in Moral Theology, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me. It's always an honor to have someone consider that you could have something valuable to say to the emerging theologians. So I'm delighted to be able to have this conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I'll start with a question that goes at the heart of the book's proposal. You make a compelling case that peace building is an alternative to more traditional forms of Christian just war theory on the one hand and of pacifism on the other. How would you define peace building, and what are its most distinctive features in your mind?
Well, so peace building is something that it's a term or an activity or a commitment that applies more broadly than Christianity. So I'll just start with the Christian stance, and I think people can imagine the larger application of it. Mm-hmm. So within the Christian churches, there is what I think at least is a fairly clear gospel mandate to forgiveness, reconciliation, love of neighbor, and nonviolence. At the same time, well, on the one hand, we also have a tradition in the New Testament of the kingdom or reign of God as eschatological, yes, but also inbreaking in its effects into history. So we have a gospel ideal and the hope or the promise that that ideal can become a reality to some extent in the world in which we live. On the other hand, though, the world in which we live is blighted by things that are very far from the kingdom and that make it necessary for Christians to really negotiate how the gospel and the reign of God will be embodied historically. So we've had two very dominant traditions within Christianity, including Catholicism. One would be just war theory. There are various ways of justifying just war. Augustine and Aquinas have somewhat different perspectives. I won't go off on that right now. But an agreement in this just war tradition, which has been the dominant one since the 4th century with Augustine, the agreement is about the necessity to use force in order to create the conditions of justice in a world broken by sin and evil. And Augustine justifies that through various strategies in which he appeals to Christian love, and Aquinas more through appeals to the common good. The pacifist tradition, on the other hand, is much less accepting of compromise in the name of the broken conditions of history. And along with that, most pacifists are mostly addressing the life of the church and discipleship within the church rather than in the larger political society, which was the frame of reference for both Augustine and Aquinas. And pacifists reject the use of force, or that would be a central commitment, although there are various types of pacifism as there are of just war theory. So there's a difference. Can force be justified or not? And if so, then we have just war theory as a tragic necessity, but still one that fits under the lens of justice. On the other side, we have a gospel community and a life of discipleship formed very strictly around imitation of Christ. And peace building is a form of Christian commitment that draws in members of both of these traditions, actually, around something that they both hold in common. And it's prioritizing the mission of the church in creating conditions of peace through reconciling violence and conflict. I am looking at this peace building vocation primarily, although not exclusively, through a Catholic lens and the lens of Catholic social teaching. I'm a Catholic myself. And so I see the mission of the church, part of the mission of the church, is to instigate and help create conditions of justice in society. And peace building also fits along that trajectory. So peace building is committed to building the conditions of peace in the midst of conflict, or in view of circumstances that could lead to conflict, and also in restoring society and rectifying conditions of injustice after conflict. So peace building has that particular social mission to really build peace concretely. And often peace builders are working within direct conflict zones where their success, and they do have a good record of success, is around reconciling particular parties in conflict or groups in conflict. So pacifists, of course, are interested in doing that nonviolently, as are just war theorists who prioritize nonviolent reconciliation of conflict.
Yeah. You mentioned a lot of things that I love to unpack little by little. One of them is that, again, while you craft and you describe peace building as a third way beyond or between the just war tradition and pacifism, you never reject either of them. You never denounce them as incompatible with the Christian commitments or incompatible with the Catholic tradition, which I find interesting. Again, you could have taken a more belligerent, if you will, attitude against these two strands of the tradition in order to reinforce your proposal. Why did you choose to do that? And did you choose to do that because you perceive that there are an important consensus that can be built, overlapping commitments?
I think what you just said is true, that there's a consensus that can be built. But I think really I began to be interested in this more existentially before theologically. And it's because around 2005 or 2007, I was invited to be a theological consultant to something called the Catholic Peacebuilding Network. And it's housed at the University of Notre Dame at the Kroc Center. But also it is co-sponsored by Catholic Relief Services. And the Catholic Peacebuilding Network, which involves both Notre Dame's faculty and so on, and a much bigger net of theologians as well, and Catholic Relief Services were really involved with situations in particular contexts where violence was a reality or is a reality. And the main locations that they worked originally were Eastern Africa, especially in the wake of the Rwandan genocide, and then continuing conflict in the region, also based on the same concerns and involving Tutsis and Hutus and the refugees that left Rwanda and went into the DRC and other places. So that was one very particular situation where Catholics were working already, not Catholics from the US primarily, but Catholics who were from those countries. And then Catholic Relief Services also sending in staff. Some staff came from the region and other staff came from outside. And so they were struggling together to figure out, how do we practically begin to diminish and alleviate violence, not on the basis of some theory that we hold in the abstract, but concretely. Another place that the Catholic Peacebuilding Network works is Colombia. And there it was a different situation. It wasn't ethnic violence, but it was violence that started out politically, involving some communist and socialist reform movements against very wealthy landowners, and that brought in some members of the Catholic Church. But in recent decades, it had really devolved into friction among gangs, wars over drugs, a lot of some illegally armed groups and militias, as well as the government and its military. So there was widespread violence, in villages, in the cities, kidnappings, recruitment of child soldiers, just as you might see in Africa. And the Catholic Church, the bishops, as well as local nuns and priests and other workers or Catholic relief services at the local level, were all involved in trying to negotiate peace. And peace accords were actually signed in 2016. So that was another, environment. And the third one was in Mindanao, the Philippines, where the conflict was between indigenous peoples who were Muslim on Mindanao, and then the post-colonial government in Manila, which was Catholic. And it was really about land rights at the bottom of it, but it became a sort of religiously identified and ethnically identified war as well. So all of these situations were first and foremost, how do we make this stop? How do we protect human life? How do we bring people together? Not everybody that was involved started from the premise that it's wrong to have the police involved or even the military involved. No, not everyone started from the premise that it is legitimate to defend ourselves or our children using armed force. In all those cases, though, the people who were the most vulnerable didn't really have access to armed force, or people saw that just armed force being picked up by everybody simply led to more violence. So it wasn't so much theoretical, or in theory, we reject all violence. And yet, in the concrete, violence was not the answer, and no one wanted more violence. So it was a coming together, really, of a nonviolent absolute in the concrete among the people that were really the victims of violence, that had enough violence, and even the perpetrators. And then also different, not even primarily theorists, but other representatives of the church, Catholic relief services and so on. So the Catholic Peacebuilding Network sponsored conferences in these different areas, where everyone from all the areas could come together at each of these conferences and share best practices. That was what it was about, share experiences. So it started out very concretely, and I saw what was going on, and I met other colleagues at these meetings who were very much proponents of nonviolence, but who had also written about just war theory, what they call stringent just war theory, like the head of the Catholic Peacebuilding Network, whose name is Jerry Powers. He's a theologian at Notre Dame, and he writes about stringent just war theory. By the time you elaborate what stringent just war theory is, it's very hard to justify war because of all the conditions that have to be met. And then there are others who would call themselves pacifists, but who still have sort of a reservation for some extreme situations when it's hard to condemn self-defense using force against an assailant. So that whole mix is how I got into it.
Wonderful. So one way to articulate the tensions between these different strands of the tradition is in terms of exegetical fights and disagreements that have happened in the tradition. You mentioned at the beginning of the conversation how scripture, the gospel, highlight the need for competing cause, competing goods that are sometimes in tension with one another. Would you go back and explain again, as you read scripture, as you engage as a moral theologian with the scriptural text, what are some of the strengths and commitments and callings that
Yeah,
you see at the heart of the gospel
yeah,
message and of scripture more broadly?
right. So, first of all, and I can say this as a Catholic, although it's not limited to Catholics, I don't believe the right way to interpret the Bible is by proof texting. So you go to one text and it says this, and then this is definitive. But so yes, there are texts about nonviolence and even non-resistance in Matthew 5, for instance. But there are also other texts that say, give unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, so which connotes obedience to the governing authority. So there's different texts in Scripture, but I think to me it seems undeniable or easy to defend that Jesus himself was nonviolent and also lived a way of life and called his disciples to a way of life that was negatively, you could state it as nonviolence, but positively it is inclusive community. It is bringing in those who are ordinarily ostracized. It is reconciliation, it's forgiveness, it's overlooking things about someone's past or even present role in order to exhibit compassion, and sort of unity in a way. Jesus is not slow to condemn people, but he condemns them for one thing primarily, maybe even exclusively, and that is oppression of the poor, such as the parable of judgment in Matthew 25, or even the parable of the Good Samaritan. It's not so much about oppression, but it's about reaching out um, to the one who's the most vulnerable and most in need of help. So, and then the central symbol of Jesus himself is the reign of God. As Mark states at the beginning of his gospel, Jesus came into Galilee preaching, repent and believe, the gospel, the reign of God is at hand. And so the reign of God is a social and political symbol, right? It's a corporate symbol. It's not about individual relation to God just on its own, but it's being part of a community that's not like the world's reign, it's God's reign. So it's not about power and domination, it's about reconciliation and being united in Christ. So to me, that's what the gospel says. And that extends even to the outsider, the other, and the enemy. But the problem is, and this gets to the friction, in some concrete circumstances, one can be torn, or a group can be torn, between serving the vulnerable neighbor who is endangered unjustly and being nonviolent, following the leadership of Jesus, but allowing through that decision harm to occur, unjust harm, not only to oneself, which is a different matter, but also to the vulnerable who are at risk. So that's where I see a tension coming in what the Bible teaches, and I don't really feel it can be resolved in a facile way.
Uh, in the book, in order to reflect on the fact that there are these tensions that cannot be resolved easily, you introduce the idea of moral dilemma.
Yeah,
And you think that everything that is connected to the ethics of war and peace needs to be reframed as a moral dilemma, which
yeah,
obviously challenges both strands of the tradition, both the just
yeah,
war tradition and the pacifist one.
yeah,
Would you
yeah,
help us reflect on the
yeah.
concept and
So
why it's important to you?
let me just go back and put a finishing sentence on what we were talking
Okay.
about, which is the gospel
Yeah.
and trying to live the gospel as part of the Christian life. And so, what I would say, because you started out asking me about peace building and what is it, and I think what peace building represents is living within that tension through a concrete way of life that tries very specifically and ad hoc almost to avoid violence by ending antagonism and conflict. So that's why it's so appealing to me. It's not primarily about a theory. It's primarily about what are we called to do as church? Not just living as church in an isolated way, but living as church in society as a seed for what Jesus represents, which is also justice, respecting human life, protecting human communities, living in political society. Those are all things from Aquinas. So the peace building is an instantiation of the gospel in fragmented, conflicted circumstances. And then that's the central thing, the remedying the conflict and, trying to create better circumstances for human flourishing and for the embodiment of Christian ideals as well. And the next question, which was about moral dilemmas, is a more peripheral question, but it was a thread through the book because I think that it's something that is very frequently ignored. And I think that it needs to be recognized because otherwise we can't really understand what the morality of peace building is like in the concrete, as well as just war theory or pacifism. And the idea of moral dilemmas is simply that there are occasions, and they're not continual, it's more of a borderline case. But yet they don't all arise just in very extreme circumstances. We can have moral dilemmas in ordinary life. They're not such high stakes dilemmas. But a dilemma is a situation where you feel rightly that there's really no good answer. You may recognize what you need to do and feel that that's your moral calling. And yet at the same time in doing that, you just feel torn because somehow an injustice is still being done to someone that's involved. But it's more important that you serve some other need at that time. And that's a moral dilemma. Like you're in a situation when you come out of it, it's not that you regret that some unfortunate thing followed. You yourself feel implicated in having caused it and having been complicit in an injustice that was done to someone, even though you wouldn't necessarily say you would choose differently because the situation as a whole demanded what you did. A kind of minor example would be when, you have two kids and one kid has special needs or has a special emergency or some special, thing that arises, and you really feel that you need to deal with that right now. But you told that your other child that you would be at their most important sports game or their ballet recital or whatever a play they're appearing in. You've promised this for months. And so you take the one child to the hospital or you deal with whatever's going on with them. And yet an injustice was done. Not just, everybody should understand this is fine, that's regrettable, but you're involved in something that you feel was really unfair to that other child, even though you wouldn't change your decision. And I think sometimes the stakes are a lot higher, like it's people's lives that are at stake, right? And yet you have to make a choice. And the complicity can be even greater. Yeah. So there's some examples in the book. And so one of the things I was kind of interested to do was to go through some of these major figures and see if there wasn't a little bit of an echo of a recognition of moral dilemmas in people that we think have much clearer theologies. Augustine, I think it's easier to find, but even in Aquinas, there's a little bit of that as well. So, and then looking at contemporary figures, and I use philosophers a lot too. There's a much more direct acknowledgement of this problem in moral philosophy than there is in theology.
Yeah.
So,
since you have mentioned them, let's talk for a moment about your way of describing Augustine and Aquinas and the relationship between the two of them.
Yeah.
In particular, as it relates to the things you were describing about particularity, ad hoc commitments,
Yeah.
moral dilemmas. For these categories, I must say, don't are not always front and center
Yeah.
in at least in the introductory moral discourse
Yeah.
of the church and of the tradition.
Yeah.
So maybe help us trace them, see them, spot them
Yeah.
in the tradition.
In Augustine, it's easier because his thinking as a whole is kind of both and conflictual,
Mhm.
and it's kind of a binary dynamic among different things that he's trying to keep in tension, so it fits much better. But if you look at his basic political framework, which is the city of God and the city of man, or the city of the fallen city, um, he makes it very clear that the Christian's real home is really only in the city of God, and the city of God is a very small space. It's not equated to the church as a whole. And yet we live in this kingdom, in the earthly kingdom, and we accept the conditions of existence there because we must do so, and we struggle to live morally good personal and political lives. But as he keeps repeating over and over in book 19, political life is full of necessities and miserable necessities, and necessities and miserable necessities, over and over and over. So you can see that he envisions the Christian as in political circumstances that are not terribly favorable to living a Christian life strictly according to the norms of the gospel. And yet he feels that this is unavoidable. There's a famous example of the so-called unjust judge in book 19, where there's a judge, Augustine is like expressing what he feels a judge would say, a Christian judge, if the judge had to make a determination to torture someone in order to find out the truth about what they did or did not do, but then also reflects on this saying, you might extract a false confession, or they might not confess and they're executed. And so at the end of the day, you don't really know if you got to the bottom of the situation in the first place, and an injustice might have been done to a just person. And then he says, how could the judge be happy in such circumstances as this? And then he uses miserable and miserable necessities and so on all around the case. So I think it's pretty easy to see some reflections of this in Augustine. With Aquinas, not quite so much. There's actually a book by one of my students. She just published her dissertation, and she and I were actually thinking and talking about this together as she was writing her dissertation and I was writing the book. So I have a lot of citations to her work. Kate Jackson Meyer in the footnotes of the book. And she just published a book with Georgetown called Tragic Dilemmas in Christian Ethics. And she actually finds some texts in Aquinas. He uses an example of a captain of a ship who in a storm has to throw cargo overboard but doesn't really want to do it. And he uses this as an illustration of something Aquinas calls repugnance of the will. And Kate brings this up as an illustration of the fact that for Aquinas, sometimes we have to do things that we don't fully will, and yet it can be justified if we truly have repugnance of the will. So it's not clear, it's like a divided intentionality, and throwing cargo overboard is bad, but again, not as bad as if there's a human life at stake. And she's got other examples from, wartime situations and so on. The way I played it out was more around the way Aquinas compartmentalizes the moral grounds of just war thinking and the moral dimensions of discipleship. So when he's talking about the conditions of war, say on his question on war, which is question 40 in the second part of the second part, I think it is. And then also when he's talking about self-defense, he does not emphasize, and this is a departure from Augustine, how decisions to go to war or decisions to use force in defense of one's own life are based on love. Instead, he says they're based on the natural inclination to preserve one's own life in the case of self-defense, and in the case of war, on the common weal. So in his description of the reasons to go to war, he mentions over and over and over again, it's for the common will, it's for the common will, it's for the common will. And we have to have right intention, which is the common will. So, and then he builds in considerations of love, but by assigning those to a special class of Christians, which would be the clergy who do not fight in war. So he has love, but not directly as a rationale behind the use of force. Whereas Augustine, and I won't go into that in detail since you didn't ask me, but Augustine has a lot of strategies to try to convince us that killing people is loving. And some of them are at odds with each other, actually. And to me, none of them are terribly convincing. Like, I feel much more comfortable with Aquinas. Let's not even go there and say that this is an act of love. It might be love for the vulnerable neighbor, but not for the person that you're killing. So there's a separation, which I think reflects the dilemma that's involved. And then with Kate Jackson Meyer, you can show how Augustine actually does have a concept of a will that's not completely coherent in its intention. So that's the moral dilemma aspect, I think.
Wonderful.
That was maybe too long for
No,
a short
that's
question.
wonderful. No, that's wonderful. And our listeners will be happy to know that Katie is on the list of authors we want to interview in the conversations tomorrow.
Yes,
Theology. So
definitely. Yeah.
more on this to come.
Yeah.
So let me ask, let me follow up on what you're saying. One way in which moral theology discourse the tradition would resolve some of the tensions you were mentioning is with the principle of double effect. It would not characterize those situations and those moral questions as moral dilemmas. Again, it would in a certain way explain them away, even if that's a negative characterization.
Exactly.
That proponents of the principle of double effect would not accept. But again, it would use the principle of double effect in those situations. So clearly, you're taking a position that, if not opposed to, is at least in tension, at odds with this traditional framework.
I think the principle of double effect can be useful, but I think in some cases it too facilely gets rid of things that we don't want to be responsible for, instead of really acknowledging the true relation of the agent to the act, and actually a relation that's reflected psychologically and spiritually in the trauma and agony of people who have to make these decisions where the stakes are very high. And so the way I look at double effect is really that it's a tool of casuist moral theology, and I don't use casuist just in a negative way. I see casuistry as an attempt to think through very carefully what moral obligation really means and to really give guidance. But I think the problem with the principle of double effect is it tends to say, well, as long as the intention was on the good effect, not the evil effect, and the evil effect isn't the means to the good effect, and there's a proportion between the good and the evil, then the agent is free and clear. We're done. No problem. Okay, we've resolved it. And I don't think it's always that easy. There's a very poignant example, not from the situation of war, but it was a book on bioethics. And it was about bioethics in the Philippines anyway. And an example was given of a very poor family that was essentially living on the streets. it was two parents and some small children and like a teenage son. And the teenage son was hit by a motorcycle and was a paraplegic. And the family would have to pay to have him sustained on a ventilator for the rest of his life. There was no free medical care or other social safety net for that. And the family obviously didn't have the money. And so the physician asked for the teenager's consent to have the life support withdrawn, or informed him that it was going to be withdrawn. I'm not sure I'm remembering exactly, but the life support was going to be withdrawn. And it said that the teenager was silent and depressed, but finally gave his consent. And where double effect comes in is because that meets the principle of double effect, right? He wasn't directly killed; it was removing a life support, etc. But however a bioethicist might analyze that, what happened was the mother, even though she consented to this because she had no other option, she had other children to help survive, she felt very guilty and very torn by the fact that she had given permission to let her son die. And the physician said, don't worry about it. It can all be handled under the principle of double effect. And that just seemed like a classic situation of not getting it. Here's this tool that we have that will resolve this human dilemma that was a tragic dilemma and, a very ambiguous, unresolvable moral case. The mother might not say, I would do it differently and let my other kids, starve to death. But there was really no way to resolve it in a satisfactory manner.
Yeah. So another situation in which this kind of tension conversation emerges in the book is when it comes to killing. Obviously, the just war tradition says that there are instances in which killing is just, so that in a certain way, there are at least strands of the just war tradition that describe it as a good, not just as a necessary evil or the lesser evil, but as a positive good. And obviously the principle of double effect, of right intention, play into that description of killing as good. You, on the other hand, want to recover the parts of the tradition, even of the just war tradition, that talk about the need for remorse, for repentance, even in cases where killing can be justified. So would you reflect on that?
Okay. So the point I was trying to make is that I believe from a human justice standpoint, but especially from a Christian standpoint, it is a violation of human dignity to kill a human being, even if that person is guilty of an offense or sin. That there's something about humanity that is inviolable in terms of aggression and killing by another person. And therefore, when killing occurs, even for justifiable reasons, for example, self-defense, protection of the innocent, that deserves regret and remorse, that an injustice has been done to that person, but perhaps in the circumstances it was morally necessary. So there's a moral ambivalence to what is occurring. And that was really the essence of the moral dilemmas category as it applies to war.
Thank you. You were mentioning, in reflecting on the role of soldiers, that they are the proximate, but not the primary agent. This made me think of the ongoing reflection present in the book about structural forces that are at the root of conflict, and how you argue that peace building tries to go to the root of these structural forces without instead focusing exclusively on individual actions. I would love to hear your thoughts about that, especially because they seem to have implications for a way of construing the moral life more broadly, not just in the case of war, but all the moral life as a way of constructing moral reflection that is attentive to things that go beyond individual agency and individual sins.
Yeah. Just last week, I was at a conference in Rome on nonviolence, sponsored by Pax Christi International and the International Federation of Superiors General. In this case, it was primarily women's religious congregations. And so it was a wonderful conference because there were people from areas experiencing conflict all around the world, and they talked about their situations and what they were doing. But one of the topics that came up was, how are these specific local situations where the peace builders are active connected to structural patterns, economic patterns? A concrete example is resource extraction. For instance, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the companies are from Western countries, and there's a huge amount of conflict and social disorder and violence occurring, not only because of mineral extraction, but that is one of the major drivers of it. Competition for the minerals and use of the profits to fund more war and violence and weapons. And that economic activity, which is so exploitative as well as environmentally damaging in the local context, is being funded by companies that make the parts for our cell phones and computers and now electric vehicles. So our demand is driving this violence. And yet, not only our demand for electronics, but that is one significant factor. And so it's not enough to just look at the problem that may exist in the DRC and look at what the bishops are doing in these other local groups without asking, can this really be ended unless the structural contributing, environment is also remedied and corrected? And I think it's not just that there's a bigger environment. I think also every individual agent is participating in any number of structures, good and bad. And our outlook, our options, our ability to consider things or to forefront some things and background others, all of that is very environmentally influenced. So I would say that it's not even possible to just talk about moral agents existing in an isolated way or having an identity that's just limited to their immediate, understanding, consciousness, intentions, activities, that we do need to look at the bigger culture. And that involves the structures and the institutions and the practices that we're part of. So I do think that attending as Christian ethicists and Catholic ethicists, especially with our long encyclical tradition of Catholic social teaching, I think the structural challenges and the need to talk about justice and solidarity across all the networks that these structures create and recognize our responsibilities within the structures and the networks that reach people in very different environments around the world, that has to be a part of thinking about justice in war and individual responsibility. But the individual combatants, they're in some decades in this country, they're draftees. That's not the case right now. But they may be young people with little other opportunity for employment or education. They may be very young. And so reflection on the whole political picture in which violence is occurring is not something of which they're always capable, and they cannot be held immediately responsible, although that's kind of in tension with, you still should not commit war crimes, and you're responsible if you do.
Certainly.
But in terms of war as a whole, the main, agents of war are government officials, but also all the economic and political interests that influence the government officials, which ultimately then goes back to the electorate, right? And what we're prioritizing or not. We could look at the war in Ukraine as an example. And that's a good case study for debates about the justice of war. But whatever you may think about it, it's certainly the case that the U.S. has sent a lot of weapons to Ukraine. And we have elected representatives that decide to do that. Is that right or wrong? And we might have different views and analyses and nuances, but the people making the decisions were put there by the larger electorate in the United States, and also by those who chose not to vote, and therefore let the majority make the decision.
So, since there are these structural factors at play, how does peace building as a practice, again, you have emphasized how it is an ad hoc negotiation with particular situations. How does peace building as a practice handle these structural forces? What are some of its commitments and habits that can cope with this structural phenomenon?
That is a big problem, and it is something we were also discussing at this meeting in Rome. Peace building, kind of in the past or typically, has tended to focus on the local, where the violence is actually occurring, and what people more at the ground level can do to reconcile differences and come to a peace accord. At the same time, the Catholic Peacebuilding Network has always been aware that it's necessary to build alliances up and down the social ladder, from the local to the mid-level leaders and authorities to sort of the national and even the international. There's a Mennonite theologian who has worked with the Catholic Peacebuilding Network named John Paul Lederach, and he has a model of a pyramid where at the bottom of the pyramid are the people, it's the popular movement, it's the grassroots. And then at the middle, you have like the Catholic bishops, you have representatives, you have community leaders, you have civil society. But it goes up to actually the political leadership in the country. And then beyond that to other, leadership of other entities whose activities influence, like who's buying the drugs that the drug trade is selling and, killing people in order to maintain their control. So it's hard to accomplish this multi-tiered structural program and effectiveness, but there is a recognition that it's important to try to address that.
Wonderful. So far you have articulated a vision of peace building that is deeply rooted in Christian commitments, in the Christian tradition. Yet in the book, you clarify also how peace building has an interreligious and cross-cultural character. How is it? Why is it the case, and how do you relate to that facet again while remaining rooted in the tradition?
Well, so just at the again, I said my interest in peace building started with exposure to the concrete. And in the concrete, it's not just Christians that want the violence to end. So on Mindanao, there were Hindus and, Muslims and Christians. And so peace building involved negotiation, mutual listening, compromise between the two sides. And, the main leaders were from Catholic Relief Services and were, some of the sort of, I don't know if you would say official, but more visible and, role identified peace builders were Christians. But there were also leaders in the Muslim community who shared these same values and goals and also wanted to find a resolution, identifying that land distribution was really at the heart of the conflict. And so some negotiations and arrangements were actually made for a different way of allocating land rights that respected more traditional law. So I think I would say that Christians do things on the basis of our distinctive values and because it's our gospel calling. But other religions have values, their deepest values, that reflect the values of Christianity. Living together in peace, compassion, reducing enmity, increasing neighborliness. These are values that are found in almost every tradition, although every tradition betrays those values, very often in concrete politics.
So you mentioned at the beginning of the book how your doctoral mentor, Jim Gustafson, was very influential all throughout your journey. And in particular, you say that you learned from him, and I quote, to form and refine theological positions critically, dialogically, and with appreciation for their existential significance. You also talk about his emphasis on the fact that theological claims are, and I quote, empty or dangerous if they fail the test of human religious experience or trivialize the scandalous reality of human sufferings. These are powerful claims that seem to shape the rest of the book, but also your broader outlook on moral theology. So would you reflect and expand on them and their impact on you a little bit?
Yeah. Jim Gustafson was always really impatient with facile solutions to problems that resorted to some, theological abstraction or reassuring biblical quote, but hadn't really looked at the existential situation and suffering and dilemmas that people were in. Everything has a reason, and it's all in God's plan, and God must have intended, for this to all result in good somehow. But that just, it seems like a way of escaping what the reality is rather than really dealing with it. So he was very impatient with all of those things. Positively, though, and I do think that this is reflected in the book, or at least I hope it is, he was a genius so his graduate seminars always involved theologians and, greats from the past that were both Catholic and Protestant. So he taught a whole course on Aquinas and Barth, and he would take Thomas Aquinas and Karl Barth on specific issues or specific theological points and just read the readings, and we would all read them. And then we would discern, okay, how are their positions the same and how are they different? And what does that reveal about their presuppositions? And what would this look like in practice? And he never used one tradition as a foil for the merits of the other. He tried to help us see what is the contribution of each of these figures? What is their most important commitment? What do they have to bring to the tradition as a whole? Even though, his center of gravity was Calvin and mine was more Aquinas, but I learned to appreciate Calvin and what Calvin had to bring because Gustafson appreciated Aquinas and what Aquinas was trying to do. So he could see the positive and also the negative on both sides.
Yeah, I think the book embodies this ethos really well in the way it deals with, again, different strands in the tradition. We won't touch on it in this conversation, but there is a wonderful and fantastically deep section of the book going through the history of the Christian tradition and its way of thinking of war and peace, which again dissects and presents in a novel way figures that as moral theologians we have always read and heard about. But again, you have a way to highlight resources and flaws that it's really unique. Overall, you ask this, you point to this question, which I thought was really beautiful. You say the question for a Christian is not whether to follow Jesus's commitment to love and nonviolence, but how. And in many ways, you see the tradition as the ongoing struggle to articulate the how, not the whether, which I thought was a refreshing and beautiful way of refraining some of the settled fights and debates.
You stated it very well, better than I did. So thank you.
Thank you. So related to that, what conversations have you engaged in because of the book? Meaning, has it been an occasion to do some of that work of common ground building, of highlighting of the commonalities that the book does in its theory? I wonder again, what was the reaction, the conversations, the collaborations that this perspective made possible?
You know, the primary environment where I have been carrying on the conversation has been the nonviolence community. So it's more the pacifism, like with Pax Christi, but also the peace building. So the people that are involved with the Catholic Peacebuilding Network. So I've participated in different online things and written, responses to different things. And I consider those people to really be my primary interlocutors. I mean, as individuals too, like the individual theologians and others who work with the Catholic Peacebuilding Network. So the Pax Christi, which sponsored this meeting that I was just at in Rome, that is more intentionally and primarily focused on nonviolence. Many of those same people reject violence absolutely, so we could call them pacifists. And I've also been involved in that discussion with my own center of gravity being more with the peace builders. I have been in conversation to some extent with just war theorists. Just as one example, a few years ago, I participated in a conference really at West Point, the U.S. Military Academy, and at that conference, the conference wasn't designed so as to go back and reconsider whether it's legitimate to have a military or for the military to use armed force, but it was more about, within that context, how can peace building and nonviolence be greater factors? How can violence be avoided and more relationship building in situations like Afghanistan? We were still in Afghanistan, the U.S. was, so that, inadvertent killing of civilians, say by drones, was more avoided and more services were provided and less violence was caused. So there's that dimension. I've also been involved a little bit, this is more through writing than through conferences, but in reconsideration of just war criteria and what they really mean. In March, I'm going to participate in a conference in the Netherlands where Catholic just war theorists will be meeting to talk about the future of just war theory. I'm not sure why I was invited to that, but I was, so I'll be dialoguing with those people because I certainly do not completely reject just war theory. As John Courtney Murray wrote, its intention or its primary function is to condemn war, also to restrain war as much as possible, and to humanize the methods of war, again, as much as possible. So it's a fraught theory, but it still has some usefulness, I think. And recently we've seen Pope Francis defend the right to defend themselves of those being attacked in Ukraine.
Yeah. So, since you mentioned Pope Francis, towards the end of the book, you claim that the recent and present history of the official Catholic teaching on peace and war is characterized by a striking paradox. This is the word you use.
Yeah.
Would you characterize the paradox, but also what you think might be the way forward, or if there is a way forward from this paradox?
Well, I think the paradox, if I have right what you're thinking of, is just simply that ever since World War I, really, with Benedict XV, Catholic popes have been very adamant that violence is not the answer. And you can quote all of them, and they repeat each other's statements. Violence is always a defeat for humanity. Violence just leads to more violence. Violence is never the answer. So there are clear condemnations of violence that sound very absolute, and yet with every pope, there's at least one or two statements or occasions on which he defends some sort of just use of armed force, especially for self-defense or humanitarian intervention. But what is also striking to me, though, is that they never elaborate or give a real platform to the justifications of force. So they acknowledge that the case can be made, but their own energy and focus is around nonviolence. So Pope Francis, like his predecessors, showcases nonviolence. He knows the value of a public symbol. So his traveling to different places, vigils for Syria in St. Peter's Square, other public gestures. So what he really wants to do is to make a case that violence is a practical political answer to conflict situations. That was the focus of his 2017 World Day of Peace message. Violence is a practical strategy for peace. So that's where his energy is. And with Ukraine, he kept sending that message. He eventually said that, of course, they had a right to defend themselves. But he doesn't linger on that point. There are plenty of other people making that case, and he knows how easily that leads to a military solution only and military strategies only. And whether the self-defense with all these weapons that other countries are sending in, especially the US, there's still, Russia has not let up. Okay, they're still bombing Ukraine. Think of the numbers of deaths and the numbers of civilians that have been killed and tortured, the destruction to whole cities, the means of reconstruction are just barely available anymore in Ukraine. So the huge devastation, whether or not the cause was originally just, the cause of Ukraine was originally just, it still has resulted in all the evils of war. So that's why Pope Francis says there's no such thing as a just war, because in the event, it will not be all just. You may have a just cause, but there will be a lot of injustice that comes out of war. And the success is often very dubious, as it is in Ukraine.
So you have highlighted the paradox. Do you think that there is a way forward?
I frankly feel very empathetic with Pope Francis on this point. I think the way forward, I don't think the paradox can be resolved. That was the whole point of moral dilemmas. But I think the way forward is just to keep working and focusing on negotiation of the conflict, the end of violence, to practically keep at it, never give up. There are many nonviolent peace initiatives going on in Ukraine now, but of course they're not government to government, not because Zelensky did not offer to meet with Putin early on in the conflict, but because Putin is not interested. So the large intergovernmental negotiation is not really going on as far as I know. But there are on the ground peace builders or peacemakers who are trying to reduce the violence. I think, with Pope Francis, or I think the model that he's holding up for us is to keep holding up nonviolence, advocating for nonviolence. Don't condemn those whose lives are in danger and who are trying to defend themselves and their families and their country, but don't get into the trap of elaborating all the reasons why violence is just, because that leads to more violence and it tends to normalize violence. Don't condemn it, but focus on peace.
Yeah. Let me finish with a more personal, vocational question, especially given our primary audience, theologians at the beginning of their careers. Multiple times during the interview, you have referred to the on-the-ground encounter with these questions, which came before the theoretical encounter with them. And you have clearly described a personal investment in peace-building efforts and movements and associations. It seems to me that has to do with the way in which you understand your role and vocation as a moral theologian. So would you reflect a bit on that? How do you understand your role and vocation as a moral theologian in the church and in the world?
Yeah. So there are two ways that question could be answered, and my answer is more on one side and not on the other. So I think there are theologians who personally are involved in negotiating conflicts in the midst of the conflicts. I can think of Elias Apongo, who's a theologian at Hekima College in Nairobi, and he runs a peace studies program there. And he has been involved in specific conflict situations that have impinged on his own existence, so he's directly involved. And he's also a theologian. And I think that that's a great thing to do, but that is not my experience. On the other side, as a scholar, and this is the other answer, I feel that it is very important, or I'm convinced, for theologians to be as knowledgeable and involved in the practical situations about which they write as they can be. It doesn't always mean participating in the first person, so to speak, but it means making the effort to be exposed, to be in conversation, to get data, to get information, and not just to write in the abstract as a kind of deduction from premises that we already hold. So in my case, I was never in a conflict zone where there was active violence going on. But when I was in Colombia, we were, driven around in a shuttle bus with an armed guard in the front. So the violence was not that far away. And we visited community centers and communities of people who had been affected or driven out of their villages by the violence. And we visited and we talked to those people who had been directly involved, as well as representatives of, say, a Jesuit social action center or the bishops' conference or the government. So we were there in the situation, but not really in the middle of the active violence. That would not be a good time to bring in, foreign visitors to study violence. Some of the people at the conferences that I went to, though, were in those situations. So it was first-person testimony from them. And that, I just think, even from that, we can learn so much, especially if you have an open mind and you're really listening and comparing what you hear in different situations, maybe not going in with a preset grid that it's all going to fit into, but it's very powerful. And I have to say the exposure that I've had through the Catholic Peacebuilding Network, but also other venues on a number of different topics, that has been very important to me as a theologian.
Lisa, thank you so much for the wonderful conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time to engage in this dialogue.
Yeah.
So I encourage all our listeners to read and reflect on Blessed Are the Peacemakers. Thank you everyone for tuning in. New Wine, New Wineskins continues its weekly Monday posts on the Catholic Moral Theology blog. And I will see you in 2 weeks for a brand new episode of the Conversations in Moral Theology. Many blessings and goodbye.
Thanks. It's been an honor to be here.